All right, looks like we have a good amount of folks on, so we'll get started in the interest of everyone's time. Thanks everyone for joining us to Future Fueled, How Transportation Innovators Are Redefining the Road. This is part of our Innovation and Entrepreneurship Forum, sponsored by our partners over at Baker McKenzie and Kearney. We're very excited to bring this conversation to you. And without any further ado, I will introduce Brent Ross, who is a partner at Kearney and a co-chair of the Innovation and Entrepreneurship Forum, to kick us off.
Thanks, Megan, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our virtual forum event. This one's called Fueling Forward, How Transportation Innovators Are Redefining the Road. I'm Brent Ross, partner at Kearney and co-chair of the Executives Club Innovation and Entrepreneurship Forum. And today I'm excited to welcome you for a discussion on innovation in transportation and specifically how new technologies are driving growth for both businesses and in civic life. We at Kearney have certainly seen a big uptake in interest in topics like micromobility, electrification, and quite a number of questions around last mile innovation that could help with different types of trips and missions that people are pursuing in transportation. So a few comments about the logistics here today. We hope you can keep your video on during this event. If you'd like a more focused view, please go ahead and put your Zoom in speaker mode, which is at the top right-hand corner of your screen. We will have time for audience questions at the end of the program, and we encourage you to use your chat to send them over. And there should be a little chat icon at the bottom of your screen that you can use for that. Today we've got a great panel and a fun panel, and on that panel we've got David Leopold from CityTech, Tom Mayer from Kearney, Andrew Smith from Uber Freight, Terry Travis from EV Noir, and our conversation is going to be moderated today by Jennifer Trock, partner at Baker McKenzie. And they've got a bunch of expert perspectives to share with you, and I'm sure we'll have a good time as well. So thanks all of you for joining today, and thanks again to our speakers for taking the time out of your day to share your insights with us. And with that, over to Jennifer.
Great. Thanks, Brent, and thanks for having us. We're very excited about this panel. I think it's going to be a fun discussion and obviously a very timely and interesting topic. So before we get too far into it, I'd love to start off with a round of introductions and kind of hear a little bit from our panelists about who they are, what they do, and maybe their best work from home tip, or if they're willing, the most embarrassing Zoom moment. I'll go first. I'm Jennifer Trock. I'm a partner at Baker McKenzie. I head up the global aviation practice and the firm's drone practice as well. And so I've been doing transportation-related things for a very, very long time, including starting my career working for the city of Chicago way back in the 90s. My best work from home tip or most embarrassing Zoom moment would have to be early on in the pandemic when I muted my phone. I thought I muted the phone, but I only muted the video, and had a very long conversation with my dog about why it was hiding the toy behind the bookshelf in the middle of a call. So with that, I'm just going to go counterclockwise on my screen. And so the next person I'll ask to introduce themselves is Tom, please.
Hi, I'm Tom Mayer, partner with Kearney in our automotive and aerospace practice. Been spending the last few years really centered around the kinds of topics we're going to talk about as a panel today, working with several of the OEMs around their autonomous vehicle, connected vehicle, electric vehicle strategies. Also working in the aerospace industry with a set of OEMs and startup companies that have been looking at urban air mobility, the future of urban air mobility. Really looking forward to the panel discussion today. And I think I'll share my thoughts on work from home best practice. I found that the Outlook calendar is really your friend for work-life integration. I make a point when I see open time in there to block out workout on the rowing machine, a bike ride, time with the family, and it's made the last few months a lot easier for me.
Great. Terry.
Good morning. Terry Travis with EV Noir. The work that we do centers at the intersection of e-mobility innovation, best practice, as well as e-mobility diversity, equity, and inclusion. I have about a decade of experience working on e-mobility, working with companies. And my passion for this started during an executive fellowship where I was in Europe working with a few OEMs there on their electrification strategies. And now we work with OEMs, utilities, state agencies, folks who are, in the DNC or delivery network companies, last mile, really to ensure that two things are happening. One, we're using innovation to drive, mobility in its best form, but also to make sure or ensure that we're providing or heading towards a future that is inclusive and beneficial to all communities.
Great, thank you. Andrew?
Yep, thanks for having me. My name is Andrew Smith, and I lead our commercial teams here at Uber Freight. For those of you who don't know Uber Freight, we've been around for about 3 years. We're one of the operating divisions within Uber. My background prior to this, I was with a software company from, two college dropouts, started it in a garage, and we ended up taking that public over a 10-year journey. And then prior to that, I was in finance in the venture capital and technology community. So really excited to come talk to the audience today around anything from logistics to final mile, as Uber is really transcending and watching everything from our rides business to our delivery business, and then freight in between as a holistic provider.
Great, thank you. And David, lastly.
Good morning. My name is David Leopold. I'm Director of City Solutions at the City Tech Collaborative. We're an urban solutions accelerator based here in Chicago that focuses on solving those complex challenges in cities that are really beyond the reach or too big for any one organization to solve. So we work by bringing together cross-sector partners to develop novel solutions that we can trial in a live test bed and position for scale through traditional market channels. So we have portfolios in mobility and parking infrastructure, public health and connected infrastructure as well. And as I mentioned, we're based out of Chicago, but partner nationally and internationally around cities that are facing similar challenges. Jennifer, to your question on either COVID tips or major sort of work from home challenges, we do quite a bit of convening and structured facilitation across our various sector partners. And as a part of that, we will often tee up an idea, get a group excited, and then ultimately break into discussion as a format that we can help facilitate. If anyone else out there are Teams users, you'll know there was an update several months ago where, in fact, a meeting pops out to a new window. And if folks have noticed, the end presentation and leave meeting buttons are immediately adjacent to one another as they're on there. And in fact, with this group, I had intended to jump right into the conversation and, in fact, left the meeting outright. And not only proved that I could do that once, I did that twice on the second meeting that we followed afterwards. So there was definitely a learning curve for me.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And hopefully by now we have all mastered all of our virtual platforms, which is actually a nice segue into how we're going to use this platform. We would love this discussion to be interactive. So please feel free to raise your hand, use the chat feature, reach out to Megan and her team, and she'll put it in the chat if for whatever reason it doesn't pop up or I'm not paying attention when it does. So thanks for that. I think we have a really great group of panelists, so thank you all for taking the time. I guess I'd like to start with just a level setting question for everyone. And obviously we're having this conversation during a very fluid time in the context of transportation and movement of goods and people in a safe way. So I'd like to open up with a question to each of our panelists to just tell us a little bit about the various challenges, but also the opportunities that have come about in the last year during the pandemic in the context of mobility, movement of goods, and social justice and transportation. And maybe just, why don't we go in reverse order from our introduction? So why don't we start with David on that?
Oh, thank you. We at City Tech run an advanced mobility initiative that focuses specifically around solving some of those more complex challenges on people and goods movement within cities. As a part of this, I think what we acknowledge and what COVID revealed is sort of the dynamic nature of transportation, and that in fact it represents the need of people living in communities, whether or not it's the cities like Chicago or smaller communities overall. Those those needs, those demands are sort of put upon then our streets and the systems that support it to be able to move forward. So I think during COVID, we saw dramatic shifts, obviously, in how people are moving around. And it revealed a lot of, quite frankly, inequitable service and other things that were known but not made clear to so many. And if you look at even transit capacity and use within Chicago, at points during the pandemic and shutdown, you had transit lines that varied from an 80% reduction in riders to only a 30 to 40% reduction in riders. So we were able to see, obviously, where options exist, where transit is certainly essential, and where improvements need to be made moving forward. I think the opportunity that we see, and I think where a great conversation to have is, as we return to a sort of post-pandemic city, what does that look like in a single moment, really opportunity to change behaviors around how we commute, where we commute, and ways to guide good practices and new collaborations between employers around their start times, cities in terms of improved service delivery, prioritization within streets, and communities in terms of equitable access.
I'm on mute. See, I thought I had solved all those Zoom problems, but apparently not. I'm going to jump around about and just and ask Terry to comment on that, particularly the last piece of what David said around on equitable distribution of transportation and opportunities and challenges that you've seen as a result of the last year's event.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with what David said more. I think that the last year has really done a number of things, but I think that what it's really done is showed us, where we are with our mobility and transportation systems. One of the things that has happened that has been really alarming is that we're working on, for example, a number of school bus pilots or electric school bus pilots around the country. And as school districts and municipalities are thinking through electrification of school buses, with the advent of COVID, what we're seeing is that you are having either no children or very few children on school buses. Now school boards are having to rethink investment in that, where fleet managers were already hesitant to make that transition because of total cost of ownership and higher price points for a point of entry. In addition to that, we've seen the rideshare industry just take do almost a 180 in its early months, because in the early months of the pandemic, what we've seen is that folks weren't really sure what was happening. So if you were a driver for rideshare in a vehicle, that who knew if that was safe or not? Do we know that masks were going to be the panacea to be able to protect folks? And we're still dealing with that, today, as a matter of fact. But what we've seen is an uptick in that. But this relates to equitable access, because what we know is that, we're working with Uber currently on a project to decarbonize the platform, to ensure that as they move towards 2030 and 2035, well, 2025, 2030, and 2035, that, we provide access to drivers in a way that is cleaner and greener. And so with that, there's a lot of work that has to be done in that as well.
Great, thanks. And Andrew, what about the transportation in the context of movement of freight and goods? What have you seen, and what challenges and opportunities has the pandemic brought around?
Yeah. So we've seen, if you take yourself back to the initial lockdowns and trying to see where you could go get supplies and rolls of toilet paper and paper towels and having our limits, our shippers and our customers saw that exact influx in demand in terms of what they were seeing from their consumers. And so what we've talked a lot about with our shippers and with our customers is this agility and what that infrastructure is going to be for you to be able to adapt in a real-time manner is going to have to think through in the future. And so where our best customers and where this is going to potentially, hopefully not manifest in a global pandemic for all of us again, but there are going to be shockwaves to our customers and our ecosystem. And how do you actually think about agility, and how do you set up for those agile-based decisions that you can actually shift in supply where you need to? The flip side is the consumer is changing. And so while we've thought a lot about e-commerce and digitization and delivery, where we think about Uber Rides business, and Terry touched on it, it went down 80, 60% of rides originated out of airports. When we all stopped getting on airplanes, no one's getting in their cars. But how do we actually think about getting healthcare workers to their offices if buses are actually not running? And so how do you think about those essential workers to get to their job places, and how do we help with that? But more importantly, then, has the consumer changed, and delivery and food delivery specifically spiked? Everyone wanted to still have meals, and once we got past the scientific hurdle of something being delivered and we're not wiping down our groceries when we got home in the first few weeks, delivery took off. And so all of those secular trends have shifted and have almost accelerated the ability for us to actually go in with customers and say, okay, what's the next shift and how agile can you be in terms of infrastructure? So I think there's a host of opportunities, but the biggest headline message we talk about is just how ripe for change and how willingness are you to adapt to that coming up to the next iteration of whatever that catalyst will be.
Yeah. No, I absolutely. I think we're seeing that a lot of places. And I wonder, Tom, from your perspective, kind of more broadly, does that kind of mesh with what you're hearing more broadly in the urban mobility space?
I think it does. One of the key things, though, in thinking about the last year is we were all picking up the smartphone more to order things, or going online to order. We had a golden moment for the growth of e-commerce. We saw a 7 or 8% increase in e-commerce share of retail sales over the last year, but it was during a year where vehicle miles traveled, and particularly vehicle miles traveled in the urban environment, plummeted. So we didn't have congestion on the street. And I think, to Andrew's point, that next big transition is going to be soon upon us as we all start to get vaccinated, and at least some start going back into the office and commuting. We're going to be back in a world of congestion down in the Loop, congestion in Lincoln Park, perhaps those multiple times a day Amazon and FedEx and UPS and Postal Service deliveries of the things that we just ordered, or the grocery delivery, or the Uber Eats, is not going to be nearly as convenient. And I think it will be very interesting over the next 3 to 12 months to see what happens with our behaviors. Do we start going to the office? How many days a week do we go? If we start to see traffic jams, does that alter our choice between continuing work from home 2 or 3 days a week and being in the office 5 days? And what does it mean for our consumption on Uber Eats or home grocery delivery, or the frequency with which we're getting same afternoon Amazon deliveries? It'll be a really challenging environment in Chicago and a lot of our urban centers in the U.S. as we get back into a new normal, but a very different normal than we had pre-COVID or we've had over the last 12 months.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And I think it'll be interesting to see the mix of people and their comfort level with taking public transit versus cars that maybe they're more comfortable taking now, and maybe that will also change that dynamic. So David, let's talk a little bit about CityTech and some of the things that you're working on, and how through some of the collaboration and cross-industry initiatives that you're working on, how that can actually have benefits for commuters in Chicago and other urban centers. And I guess to Tom's point, how soon will we see those benefits, and how do you envision them coming online?
No, absolutely. They're great questions. It's part of the reason why 2 years ago, and certainly given the complexity of some of those issues, why 2 years ago CityTech launched our Advanced Mobility Initiative. I mentioned it earlier, but the initiative itself acknowledges that our personal and freight mobility systems in cities are inherently public and private. if you include the infrastructure that supports it, the passengers, the business models, and the regulatory roles. So innovating and changing within that space requires a cross-sector conversation, certainly suited for City Tech and our partners to move forward. So we looked specifically at launching an initiative initially with lead on our industry side from Microsoft, Bosch, Here Technologies, the City of Chicago, and over 30 partners, including civics like the Illinois Autonomous Vehicle Associations, universities, national laboratories, and others, many of which are on the call today, and we're thrilled to partner with. Really, we set out a roadmap looking at seamlessness in cities. How do we reduce friction between modes, between trips, between various segments of a trip, and do so in a collaborative way where we're solving common public challenges around it? To your point around the transit side, one of those challenges came up for us immediately after COVID, and we looked at specifically the new public health caps on public transit agencies nationally and internationally. In Chicago, initially during lockdown, it was 15 people on a bus and 22 on a train car. And we convened our partners cross-sector, including the cities of Los Angeles, London, and others, and said, do we know at this point exactly how many people are on a bus relative to those restrictions for safe operations? And the answer that we found from that was, well, sort of, right? We know how many people get on, we don't know how many people get off. Some systems have weight sensors, some do not. There's sort of an inexact science to it. But obviously that's a critical piece in terms of safe operations and in terms of proactive customer engagement and other things. So we were very proud to announce last week a new solution that we're developing with Chicago Transit Authority, Genetec, Microsoft, and Intel, looking at ways to collect anonymous count data of ridership that will allow for better bus operations, better future train operations, and allow for that type of data in the future to be able to be made public and shareable so that people can make better decisions for themselves around their trips and around integrating with other modes. So we're thrilled to be running that pilot this spring, and I think really teeing it up really in a way, hopefully, that is able to scale locally here in Chicago, but really throughout the industry where that type of core data and occupancy data capability, can be beneficial across transit systems in the US and beyond.
Exciting stuff. And maybe turning to Andrew in the freight world, can you talk a little bit about kind of how technology has improved and will continue to improve the efficiencies in last mile delivery, and as well as kind of the entire freight supply chain, and if you've seen the pace of innovation increase in the last year, or if it's just kind of what's going on in that entire area?
Yeah, there's a couple things. I mean, one, we are long believers in betting on the speed of light versus the speed of sound, and we think the digital kind of awareness and the telemetry in terms of where truckers are and where trucks can have open capacity can have a huge impact, one, on our environment, right? So about 6% of all CO2 emissions come from highway miles that are driven by trucks. When we think about actually optimizing the utilization of trucks, we think of that as making sure that the truckers reduce their empty miles. And so we develop algorithms and then also matching technology to understand where the trucks are and how do we actually do those matching for those trucks to make sure that they're, one, reducing their carbon footprint, but two, raising their utilization, right? They've got a fixed asset, they're trying to actually drive more utilization. So where our bundles actually see about a 22% increase in or reduction in deadhead miles for those truckers, and I think ultimately that will have an immense impact back on, one, our environment, but two, on the economy for this. The secondary component is, how do you make the entire ecosystem more efficient? And this is the asymmetry of transit in terms of logistics and supply chain, right? How do I know that the truck coming down or that's sitting outside of this facility is empty? Or how do I actually have a last mile delivery going into this location and it could be taking something else? And so those are really the structural walls. If I think about the short term, just how do we take and optimize on what's going on today? In the longer term, we're trying to break down those barriers of asymmetric information and say, how do we actually connect the entire ecosystem to uncover more efficiencies that we can deliver? So if I'm going and I'm ordering some sort of food delivery coming in, and I have a matched delivery from the same strip mall for some food or from Home Depot, can you throw it in the trunk from a driver in terms of our delivery product? So that's, I think of the world of possibilities actually just at the forefront if we think about breaking down those walls of asymmetry. And that's really where we're trying to push the industry, the regulation. How do we think about making the entire open ecosystem more collaborative?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Tom, picking up on that, from your standpoint, are any insights that you might have on technological benefits, the pace of innovation, as well as trends that you're seeing in urban mobility and things that we should be watching for in the short term?
So it's been a really exciting year, and I think to me a big piece of it came together when I was listening to Mobileye in the virtual CES this year. Mobileye is a sensor manufacturer that's out of Israel that supports most of the major OEMs around autonomous vehicle development. And they told just a fantastic story. Over the last 18 to 24 months, a number of the global automakers have started putting modems on their cars, and they've started actually collecting the video data off of the advanced driver assist systems, the cameras that support your automatic lane keeping and the like. 2 years ago, in order for Mobileye to develop the detailed maps down to millimeter level of everything within 30 feet of the street that are really necessary to support an autonomous vehicle, they would go into a city with specially outfitted vehicles covered with cameras. They would spend 12 or 18 months and hundreds of person years developing a map of a city. The story that they told, they went into Frankfurt last October. They had over 10,000 vehicles in the city where the automotive OEMs were providing the camera data off of consumers' vehicles. It took them 2 weeks and 28 person days to create a drivable map of Frankfurt and to train their driving system, not just on the streets, but on the driver behavior at intersections. So taking that intersection of digitized vehicles, connected vehicles, and all of the work that's been going on in autonomous vehicles, we are just moving forward incredibly quickly. You're starting to see it in some of the OE announcements of level 2, and at least in other countries, Germany in particular, level 3 autonomous drive systems that can do lane changes on highway without human intervention. You still have to be paying attention, but the car can actually take over much more of the driving. And to me, that really starts to come together with things like GM's Cruise division out in San Francisco, or Waymo that's been driving in Scottsdale, Arizona for almost a year and a half now, and recently moved into the San Francisco market. It's going to get us to autonomous mobility in urban centers. And from an equity standpoint, the one thing the one thing I'm confident about is an autonomous vehicle will not have concerns about pickups or drop-offs in certain neighborhoods. So we'll get much, much better service in personal mobility, much more equitably distributed across cities going forward as we start to go autonomous.
Thanks, Tom. And before we move on to the next question, just as a reminder, I think all of us, this panel, we have so much to talk about, and we could go on all day, but I really do encourage you to ask questions through the chat. If you have any, we're happy to break up the discussion. But picking up on that last comment, Tom, about social justice and equitable services across underinvested communities, Terry, can you tell us a little bit about EV Noir's work in this area and how e-mobility contributes to social, economic, and environmental benefits in these communities?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we know is that our current transportation system is inequitable. From historic and systemic issues, we know that certain communities are disproportionately overburdened by the negative impacts of transportation emissions in our current transportation system. And we need to utilize innovation and programming and pilots to ensure that as we move forward, we're doing so in a fashion that is really encompassing and involves strategies that make sure that all segments are lifted up. Because what we know about that is that transportation is just not a one-issue thing. It actually also provides access to education. It provides access to healthcare. It provides access, in many instances, to workforce and economic development opportunities if done correctly. So there's a huge opportunity to begin to connect the dots in a real-world way. More recently, we partnered with Northwestern actually to publish a report that looked at, charging infrastructure gaps. If you look at Metro Chicago and you take the south side of Chicago or the west side of Chicago and the south side of Chicago, charging infrastructure is lacking, for lack of a better term. And as we move towards a future that is electric, connected, shared, and autonomous, as was mentioned earlier, it's going to be really critical that if we're going to move forward in a real intentional way, that we have to have the tools to be able to do so. The infrastructure and transportation system that we currently are operating under is about half a century old, and we need to do quite a bit of modernization to grid, as well as to rethinking how folks have access to mobility. As a whole, one of the things that I didn't mention earlier is the principals and founders of EV Noir, also the principal and founders of EV Hybrid Noir, which is the nation's largest network of diverse EV drivers and enthusiasts. And we have members and chapters in Illinois and around the country. And we do a lot of advocacy and engagement to actually bring communities that have often been left at the margins of these conversations into the conversation and at the table, because what we understand best practices to be is engaging communities first and often, and being able to craft a strategy that is not beneficial for some, but beneficial for all.
Great, thank you. And it's great to see how all of these things really do tie together, and the need to get so many different stakeholders involved in realizing these technological benefits. As we've talked about, there's a lot of innovation in this area, particularly around autonomous vehicles, technology, and ride sharing. I'm interested, maybe starting with you, David, on the relationship, between innovation and the regulatory frameworks that you work with. I know in my space of aviation, as drones became more popular, there was, the drone technology far outpaced the regulatory framework that allowed the use of, and it's still somewhat the case. How are you seeing that relationship between innovation and the regulatory frameworks that you're working with, and what we should be watching for in that space as we move forward?
No, it's a really interesting question, and in fact, there's some common themes and there's some common collisions, right? If you pardon the pun, that happen within our streets, particularly around innovation. Given some of the actors that are there, our streets really they serve many different masters, right? There are initial constituents immediately adjacent to that block. There's the role of a street in a network within a city, obviously, and then there's a role in streets, particularly even broader in terms of connecting interstate commerce. And you'll find that different users line up around those regulatory frameworks. So, for example, rideshare is permitted locally as a business. Freight is regulated oftentimes at a national level, as you look at the requirements that they have to local municipalities around everything related to data sharing and others. I think the one thing that, if we consider the horizontal plane, sort of leaving the airspace outside of it for a moment, the one thing that all of these groups have in common is the space. There's only so much square footage to go around relative to the competing needs and priorities within our public assets. And in fact, that is a starting place for collaboration where it's not necessarily competitive for those different groups to work together. And what we've seen across our different industry sectors is that there's a progression that can happen, where if you start to create just pure data that looks at utilization, occupancy, real-time use, if that is starting to be able to be shared, you're able to look at operational efficiencies, either to those users or to the organizers of those infrastructure. And then from there, you're able to take sort of a classic business model or classic operational step to either be more proactive in terms of that management, or more predictive, or more integrated and comprehensive as a part of it. So we're cheering on and supportive of the work by the Open Mobility Foundation and others to look at data standards to be able to facilitate that. I think Andrew's work that he mentioned at Uber in terms of bringing together and breaking down walls between current data barriers is very important. And even our work at CityTech, of the 11 solutions that we've moved forward in 2 years within our advanced mobility initiative, I mentioned our transit capacity work, looking at getting baseline information for transit to share. We've also done work with Here Technologies and others at Millennium Garages on how we create indoor maps for underground spaces that can help with guidance and wayfinding when your traditional cellular connections aren't working. So starting first with data, reaching then into collaboration, operational efficiency, and proactive. I think those are good steps that is common ground for competing interests within streets.
Fantastic. And I know we have one question, but I just wanted to pick up on the theme with Terry a minute before we get to that question. In the context, you had mentioned a minute ago kind of the disparate allocation of charging stations in different parts of the city and some of the hurdles that come on with the existing physical infrastructure. And I'm wondering, kind of, can you talk to us a little bit about whether those challenges are ones of resources, regulation? Is it systemic policies that are really impeding the ability to deploy a more equitable infrastructure system?
It's a bit of all and more. So the idea is that we're dealing with the frontier technology. So EV, AV, autonomous, shared, all of this is frontier technologies. And so, we're building the car as we're driving, so to speak. And so the idea is that in addition to that, we have, we're dealing with some very simple things as well. 100 years of habit with fossil fuels. So as we begin to break out of that paradigm and go to a mobility future that has more possibilities, there's going to be some trial and error. And so with that, you have several parts of the country, several regions of the country that are really leading in this conversation, and others are waking up to find out, where things are nationally and globally. And so with that, as we think about, equitable mobility and an equitable transportation system, it's really important to understand that, it really comes down to, it's not one thing. There's no policy that's going to solve all of the, issues around this. There's no pilot or program. We have to use a multi-channel, multi-layered approach that we do a lot of simultaneous things. So we're literally engaging community first and often. We're going in to develop policy that's beneficial to more segments of the community. We're investing in infrastructure that will allow for, as Uber and Lyft and Amazon and all the other companies that are going to play a role in this ecosystem, from last mile delivery, and then as General Motors, Nissan, Volvo, Ford, all these others begin to make more offerings that in the light duty space. And then as we think about what's happening, as Andrew spoke about, in the medium and heavy duty, we have to think about this in a really comprehensive way, expanding our thought process around it. And so as we begin to do that, we'll see change. And, thankfully, one of the things that we also know is that we have, at the federal, state, and local levels, there's an environment now that's a lot more favorable for innovation than we've had over the last few years. So we should see some expansion and some advancements in a number of ways.
That's great. Okay, well, thank you for that, Terry. And let me get to the question that we have in the chat, and maybe I'll start with you, Tom. How are organizations really balancing this need for innovation as a competitive advantage, while also recognizing that our transportation systems are systems of systems, where there needs to be a lot of interoperability between competitors and the public sector? And I would just kind of layer in the different regulatory frameworks within all of that, right? It's pretty complex. So how are you seeing organizations balance that? And then I'd love to get the other panelists' thoughts on that as well.
So I think what's starting to happen around electric vehicle charging is a great example of that system of systems, right? If you look at it a couple of years ago, Tesla proprietary supercharger was really the only national network. As more and more OEs, whether domestic or global, really started to make sincere investments around EV, very quickly those players recognized that it only worked if there was widely accessible and common shared EV charging infrastructure. And you saw a voluntary agreement among the the legacy automakers, as well as a number of the newer electric vehicle startups, to move to a common standard for charging infrastructure. So today, with the exception of Tesla, you see interchangeability in charging stations and an ability to charge any vehicle that you're buying, whether from Cadillac, from Ford, from Hyundai. They all work off of the same charging infrastructure. And I think that's a huge move forward. In terms of the regulatory environment, I think unfortunately it's still, at the technology level, still very ad hoc. Everyone in and around vehicle autonomy, and frankly, people in and around the automakers thinking about EV standards, fleet fuel economy standards, and the like, were hoping 18 months ago for robust national frameworks. But we're still in a world where we have state-by-state decision-making around what's a roadworthy, licensable, autonomous vehicle. We still have city-by-city choice decisions that live underneath those state decisions. And it's becoming a real mess in terms of technology development. I think to David's point earlier, the states and the cities and even sub-districts within the cities have a huge role to play in thinking about things like curb space management and congestion management. But we really need to get to national standards in terms of vehicle licensing, what's a safe autonomous vehicle, what's a safe operating system, and what investments we're going to choose to make around electric vehicle charging.
Great, thanks. Andrew, what do you think about some of the things that Tom said and this question about the need for innovation as a competitive advantage, but also the need for interoperability within the system?
I think that Tom hit the nail on the head. I think there's going to be new modes of supply, right? Whether that's drones, whether that's AV, whether that's, what I used to joke, the Uber Freight or the Uber Air division, right? That now is going, and we're gonna, it's the Jetsons group, we used to call them internally, right? Where we're gonna go take a helicopter and get transported across the city of LA. So there's gonna be an influx of new supply opportunities. The question then is, the definition of a network is gonna fundamentally change, because it is a system of systems, right? And so the network has to be the hub of how do you actually interconnect these. And so there's a network of charging stations that you can go access, right? There's a network of freight, there's a network of last mile. And so then it's a connection point to the consumer, comes into an e-commerce network that allows them to go buy, whether that's Target or Amazon that has third-party sellers to meeting the consumers, and then the network effect in the middle. But then how do you actually continue to then plug in the supply side of the network? So if you go to Target or Home Depot and then you actually need a last mile delivery, how do I get that delivered to my home that day within 4 to 6 hours? And so it is the connection of all of those. And that's where you have to then think about the harnessing of these networks. And then those networks have to then have the intersection to government and policy to make sure that they're making sure that we are safe and following the right guidelines. And the government needs to come up with the right regulatory framework for those networks. And that's the difficult part. When we think about the air travel, the team looked at the data. There are about 5,000 aircrafts in the air over the United States at any one point in time. When they looked at the city of LA, they thought 5,000 helicopters could be flying to move people around. Well, there's no on-ramps. There's no interstate for aircrafts. It's all control tower to control tower. And they can't redesign it because they can't take it down for 3 months and redesign it and then bring it back online. So I really think the harnessing of the network is the innovation that we need to think about, and making sure that that is the foundation that we can all operate within.
I think about that a lot in the context of drones as well. I think there's something like 350,000 manned aircraft that are on the U.S. registry and about 1 million drones. And I think as that technology comes online, we're struggling in my sector with kind of, it's called UTM, kind of the unmanned traffic management, how we deal with that just for the drone infrastructure. I saw David and Terry both nodding in violent agreement with some of the things that Andrew was saying. Wanted to give you an opportunity to also comment on that as we're having this discussion.
No, I think that, you know, a lot of what was said was very spot on. The idea, one of the things that I would actually add to that conversation is I think that as we think about mobility in its multimodal sense, one of the things that it's going to come online sooner than I think many people are thinking about is mobility as a service. And that's going to be across different sectors. So I spoke at a smart cities conference last year and they brought a, you know, autonomous box truck. In addition to the fact that when we think about transportation as a whole, mass transit is going to become a lot more autonomous. You're going to have a lot more autonomous vehicles in the space. And mobility as a service, being able to hit a button on your watch and have a vehicle come pick you up that you don't have to maintain, pay for parking, fuel, maintenance. I think the cost paradigm is going to really be something that you're going to see a higher ramp in the adoption of that than I think that most consumers are really understanding at this point. And so there are, you know, any number of the partners, any number of the companies that have been mentioned today, many of them we're working with on EV, AV programs. And as we're in these conversations, it's really interesting to see like how fast this is coming and where that disconnect between where consumers are. So part of what we have to do is begin to ramp up education and engagement so that we begin to normalize it. You know, the idea, remember distinctly, you know, when rideshare was launched, talking to my family and them saying to me, like, you mean I'm going to get in the vehicle with someone that I don't know the quality or safety or that, like, never. And now you fast forward, you know, 7, 8 years, and now it is the norm. Like my mom will ask me, can you send me Uber Eats? And I could be across the country. But the idea is that we have to begin to think about matching some of this innovation with education and outreach, and then really beginning to prepare our communities for this.
Yeah, I hear that loud and clear, and it's one thing that we talk a lot about in the in my sector, and getting people comfortable flying in a self-piloted aircraft someday. I mean, it's a big leap of faith. But before we get there, we have to get people comfortable with doing that in a self-driving car, right? And so there's a progression, and that human element is going to be really key. David, any final thoughts on this topic?
No, it's your last comment, and I think Jerry's initial question is a really good one. And you know, it makes it challenging to innovate, right? Because it is a system of systems, and in fact, if you want to do things different, do you have to change each of the systems and their systems before the world can be different, or which comes first, the chicken and the egg? I think it's interesting. Cities will, because of the rapid pace of innovation that Tom talked about and that industries are going through. Cities are going to have to change their approach in terms of investment, in terms of collaboration, in terms of being able to maintain public interest and still drive forward these innovative ideas, particularly as they're working with the private sector. And what we see across our portfolios and what we're working on is that in many ways across cities, the challenges are the same, but they're inevitably represented ever so slightly differently in different communities, different cities, things along those lines. And you'll find things ranging from business model to attitudes towards public-private partnerships to usability, cultural relevancy. I mean, there's so many different things that ultimately need to be customized. But if you look at all the solutions, the tech, the shiny things we're talking about, if you look under the hood at the tech stack, 80% of our solutions are made out of the exact same ingredients when we look at it. We recently did some work, I'll see if I can post it to the chat with Intel, around sort of a common foundation. And if you look at the physical design, the sensors, the network, the compute, the analytics are all about the same things. And in fact, we're focusing on that last 20% instead of the upfront 80. And I think we see a really clear need for cities, the technology sector, and others to come together to say, what can we agree on relative to what's most in common? And how do we regulate, create data privacy, create data sharing? How do we look at policy within streets and other things around that core 80? Because then you start to see it rationale for public investment. Then you start to see the beginning of those partnerships forming, a great place for common ground. And then that final 20% should be different. It should scale differently. We should have innovation at the edges where people are taking that certainty and building investments, capital, and other things around the outside. So in our view, I think we've learned enough around technology development that those core tech trends are going to stay. And in fact, I think that's where we need to place our innovation in a way that allows us to collaboratively break through the chicken and the egg and build some meaningful solutions for our communities.
Awesome. It's really exciting stuff, and I think I know we're kind of close to time, so I'm going to wrap it up. I mean, we're just at the beginning of a new administration, which has a really strong commitment to innovation, to sustainability, to a lot of the technologies we've been talking about. And so, as we if I could just do my crystal ball question, if we look 10 years into the future, if we have this panel 10 years from now, hopefully not on Zoom, hopefully in real life. Can I ask you just to tell me in 10 or 15 seconds, what do you think, what will we be talking about in 2031? Let me start with Andrew.
I was hoping I was going to go at least third on that question.
Oh, well, then we can.
No, look, I do think in 10 years, I think the question we often talk about, and I'll just pose it as more of a question, is what is the definition of an urban environment versus where our populace lives, right? And so years ago, it was very city-centric, and then it sprawled out into suburbia and kept going. And so it made those constraints on networks harder and harder as you thought about supply and demand. Right. And so if you think about ride sharing or taxis or anything else, it was fine if you had medallions in New York City because the population was concentrated. And as you spread out, it became harder and harder to actually provide benefits. And you started to see rail systems and light trains and all the rest expand. And now we're starting to see a contraction over the last few years where people were actually gravitating more back towards city living to reduce their times commuting to actually be closer to their workplaces. And COVID completely blew that up, right? We can be distributed, people can have no offices. And so I think probably the biggest question I have in 10 years is, what does our work-life balance look like and where are we physically located? Because that has probably the biggest impending network effects or demand on transportation of what solutions we need to design if we are more distributed or tightly coupled. And so that's probably more the human nature of just where our cities will thrive and develop over the future that we think about long term.
Tom, 2031.
So as I think about 2031, I don't think anyone on a panel will be spending a lot of time talking about autonomous mobility, because I think, to Terry's point, it will just be a thing that we're used to using all the time. I do think, Jennifer, that in terms of drones and comfort, flying in an eVTOL urban mobility, we may be starting to see some early pilots similar to what Waymo spent the last couple of years doing in Scottsdale with autonomous vehicles. But I think we'll be having a lot of discussion in 10 years about the real live potential for urban air mobility. And I think we'll be having some discussions on the back of what we're beginning to see Blue Origin, SpaceX, and Virgin Space talk about. We'll be having a lot of discussions around space tourism in a decade.
Music to my ears. Terry, how about you?
So, you know, obviously, going back to what I was saying earlier, I think that private car ownership will probably look very, very different. I think that as we think through this paradigm, like some of the most inefficient things we own are cars. And so the idea of, you know, fully autonomous, connected, shared electric vehicles, I think will become commonplace hopefully in 10 years. I don't think that, you know, private car ownership or internal combustion engine vehicles will disappear, but I think that market share will absolutely skew in a very different direction. I think that as we think about innovative trends such as, you know, VTOL and looking at, you know, if we go back to the turn of the century, 85% of Americans, you know, were farmers. They were in the agricultural industry. So folks kind of lived in their own communities. And I think with the advent of, you know, vehicles and transportation sector, it expanded things. I think that through innovation, it'll expand even further. So now real estate will look very different because you'll be able to commute in and out to go to work from you know, you don't have to live in city center now in 10 years. So I think that we'll see through innovation, I think we'll see things or trends like that that will reimagine and redefine what mobility really looks like.
Great. Thanks for that. And David, how about you? 2031.
2031. I think that a lot of the tech trends and a lot of the exciting things we've talked about today, the underlying tech has driven particularly private sector towards more demand-based business models. We've seen that in rideshare, we've seen that in freight delivery and many other areas. And I think as it's continuing to play out in cities, it's shown that demand and then those services are not able to equally serve residents, and that there's a big clash there relative to the public subsidy that supports the transit sector overall, transportation sector overall. So I think if you translated, this is my personal opinion, if you translate a demand-based business model to public sector language, it's performance-based. And how can those same technologies allow us to look at performance-based planning, data-informed and performance-based infrastructure investment, and long-term operations? And I think that will allow us, hopefully, to have different questions around goal setting, where instead of infrastructure funding, we're looking at trip distance between residential areas and quality jobs. We're able to sort of redefine the public dialogue around where this investment's tending to go, and hopefully done so in a way that allows us to use the data, technology, and tools that we've talked about today to support both public interest and private enterprise.
Perfect, thank you. And I hope, I want to say a huge thank you to the panel, and I hope that we can all be together in 10 years. I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Mike, to wrap us up.
Hi, thanks, Jen. Good afternoon again, everyone. I'm Mike Stoker, partner at Baker McKenzie and co-chair of the Innovation and Entrepreneurship Forum. What a great discussion we heard. Thank you very much to each and every one of our fantastic panelists. It was everyone did a great job. And as the pandemic has caused us to re-examine our relationship to travel and transportation, I think it's fascinating to see some of the trends that emerged that our panelists discussed today. What struck me the most about this conversation was, even when confronted with a difficult year, as this past year has been, there is a silver lining in that it's helped reveal issues with the existing transportation systems that will lead, hopefully, to improvements and efficiencies that we can all enjoy when the pandemic is behind us. And personally, I'm very much excited about advancements in autonomous mobility technology and mobility as a service. But we hope you found this information helpful to carry you through the rest of your week. Keep an eye on the Executives Club website for more upcoming virtual programs. And in particular, we hope you can join us on April 12th for the Food and Beverage Forum's Fireside Chat with Whole Foods CEO John Mackey. You can sign up online at www.executivesclub.org. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And thanks again for joining us, and see you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.